Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel and listen to my stories every day. It started like any other day, mundane and predictable, with no warning of the storm about to descend on my life. I was in our shared home office, a quiet corner of the house that Julia and I both use sparingly, given her busy hospital schedule and my work-from-home routine. I was rifling through the filing cabinet, hunting for the insurance papers our broker had requested. Instead, my fingers brushed across a slim envelope marked with Julia's neat handwriting. At first, I hesitated. The envelope wasn't sealed, and curiosity tugged at me. It was labeled "Personal Statements," which I assumed meant bank or credit card records. As her husband, I had access to all our financials, but we rarely meddled in each other's accounts. Still, something about the envelope felt off. I opened it, telling myself it was innocent. Inside were statements from a credit card I didn't recognize. I froze as I scanned the page. It wasn't the name of the card that caught my eye, it was the transactions. The charges were mundane at first: groceries, gas stations, a few department stores. But then I saw it, a $2,500 purchase at a jewelry store I'd never heard of, followed by a string of charges at hotels, spas, and high-end restaurants. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe these were gifts she hadn't told me about. Perhaps the hotel stays were work-related, something to do with her conferences or overnight shifts. But deep down, I felt the unease creeping in. My wife was meticulous about discussing finances. She would have mentioned a purchase this large, or so I thought. I sat back in my chair, holding the statement in my trembling hands. The room felt colder, quieter. Every creak of the house seemed amplified, as if mocking the silence between Julia and me. She had always been the pillar of honesty, or at least she appeared to be. I couldn't think of a single time she had lied to me, not even about trivial things. That's why the discrepancies in the statement felt like a betrayal of monumental proportions. I spent the next hour poring over the remaining pages in the envelope. They told a story I wasn't ready to hear. Dinner reservations at places I'd never been to, trips that didn't align with her work schedule, and a name that appeared more than once: Adam's Bistro. The name didn't mean anything to me then, but it would soon become a symbol of everything I'd lost. When Julia came home that evening, I felt like I was staring at a stranger. She breezed through the door, her white coat draped over one arm and her hospital bag slung over the other. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her smile warm as ever. "Hey, James," she called out, dropping her things on the entryway table. "What's for dinner?" I forced a smile. "Thinking of ordering in." "Long day?" "Exhausting," she replied, leaning in to kiss my cheek. Her lips were soft, familiar, but her touch felt foreign. "Double shift?" "I just want to shower and collapse." I nodded, watching her retreat to the bathroom. Her movements were as graceful as always, but now they seemed calculated, like someone performing a well-rehearsed role. I wondered how many of her smiles had been real, how many words had been lies. That night, I couldn't sleep. Julia lay beside me, her breathing steady and serene, while my mind raced through 1,000 scenarios. Was I imagining things? Was there a logical explanation for the charges? Or had she betrayed me in ways I couldn't yet fathom? By morning, I decided I needed answers. Confronting her without proof would only lead to denial, or worse, accusations of paranoia. I needed someone who could help me untangle this web of deceit. A quick search online led me to Eric Cook, a private investigator with glowing reviews and a reputation for discretion. When I called his office, his assistant informed me he was available for a consultation that same afternoon. Sitting across from Eric in his dimly lit office, I felt a mixture of shame and determination. I wasn't the type of man who doubted his wife. I wasn't the kind to pry. But here I was, laying out the pieces of a puzzle I couldn't solve alone. Eric listened patiently, taking notes as I spoke. When I handed him the statements, he glanced at them briefly before looking up. You think she's having an affair, he said matter-of-factly. I don't know what to think, I admitted. But something doesn't add up. He nodded, leaning back in his chair. Leave this with me. I'll start with the basics, tracking her movements, digging into her connections. If there's something to find, I'll find it. The days that followed were some of the longest of my life. Every time Julia left for work, I wondered if she was going to the hospital, or somewhere else entirely. Her smiles felt hollow, her laughter forced. I found myself second-guessing every word she said, every glance she cast in my direction. When Eric finally called me back, his voice was somber. You should come in, he said. We need to talk. I knew then that my worst fears were about to be confirmed. Eric's office was dimly lit, its walls lined with filing cabinets and shelves stacked with manila folders. The air smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink, a combination that somehow made the room feel colder. He motioned for me to sit down across from his desk, sliding a thick envelope toward me. You're going to want to brace yourself, he said, his tone professional but tinged with sympathy. I hesitated before picking it up, my fingers fumbling with the clasp. Inside, there were photographs, documents, and a USB drive. The first photo I pulled out made my stomach drop. It was Julia, smiling, radiant, and unmistakably holding hands with a man I recognized instantly, Adam Hawkins, her former boss. The photos were damning. Julia and Adam at a restaurant, her head tilted back in laughter. The two of them entering a hotel, his hand resting lightly on her lower back. I could feel my chest tightening with every image, each one more incriminating than the last. Eric cleared his throat, drawing my attention back to him. The affair's been going on for at least 10 years, possibly longer. We believe it started when she was up for a promotion at her old job. 10 years. My voice cracked, the words barely audible. That's impossible. Eric slid another sheet of paper toward me, a timeline he'd constructed based on her travel records, financial transactions, and the surveillance photos his team had gathered. The dates matched up with Julia's conferences and overtime shifts. Every weekend she had supposedly been away for work was listed, complete with hotel stays booked under Adam's name. She's been careful, Eric said. But not careful enough. Most of their meetings were discreet, out-of-town hotels, private dinners. But recently, they've gotten bolder. Either they think no one's paying attention, or they've stopped caring. I stared at the timeline, the pieces of my life falling into place with cruel precision. I thought about all the nights I'd stayed home with our kids, believing Julia was working hard to build her career. I thought about the dinners I'd cooked for her, the anniversary gifts I'd saved for, the moments I'd been proud of her accomplishments. All of it felt like a lie now. What about Adam? I asked finally. Is he married? Eric nodded. He's been married for 20 years. His wife doesn't seem to know, or maybe she chooses not to see it. The thought made me sick. 2 families, 2 lives shattered by their selfishness. I clenched my fists, struggling to keep my composure. The anger burned hot, but beneath it was a deep, aching sadness. How could Julia do this to us? To me? There's more, Eric said, reaching for the USB drive. We found evidence that Adam's been involved with other women as well. Your wife isn't his only affair. That revelation hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just about the betrayal anymore, it was the humiliation of knowing Julia had been reduced to one of many. She wasn't special to him, just another conquest in his collection. I left Eric's office with the envelope clutched tightly in my hands, my mind racing. Driving home, I tried to make sense of it all. The lies, the deceit, the sheer audacity of it. How long had I been blind to the truth? Had there been signs I ignored, moments I dismissed as paranoia? The house was quiet when I arrived. Julia was still at work, the kids at school. I sat in the living room, staring at the photos and documents spread out on the coffee table. The more I looked, the angrier I became. Every detail felt like a personal attack, a deliberate effort to undermine everything we had built together. I thought about confronting her that evening, but the rage bubbling inside me wasn't ready to be contained. I needed a plan, a way to take control of the situation without letting my emotions get the better of me. Over the next few days, I started preparing. I consulted a lawyer, Jennifer Pratt, recommended by Eric. She was sharp, no nonsense, and had a reputation for handling cases like mine with ruthless efficiency. Gather everything you can, she told me during our first meeting. Bank statements, texts, emails, anything that proves infidelity or misuse of joint assets. The more evidence we have, the better your position will be. I spent hours combing through our financial records, looking for patterns, anomalies, anything that could support my case. The jewelry store purchased stood out, as did several other unexplained expenses. There were dinners and trips she'd never mentioned, gifts I'd never received. Each discovery felt like another nail in the coffin of our marriage. Meanwhile, Julia continued her routine, oblivious to my growing knowledge. She laughed with the kids at dinner, kissed me goodnight, and left for work each morning with the same practiced smile. It was almost impressive how easily she maintained the facade. One evening, as she sat across from me at the dinner table, I found myself studying her face. She looked tired but content, her blonde hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. I wondered what she was thinking, what lies she was rehearsing in her mind. Did she feel guilty? Or had she convinced herself that her actions were justified? "Everything okay?" she asked, noticing my silence. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just a lot on my mind." She nodded, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to demand answers, but I knew it wasn't the right time. Not yet. The turning point came when Eric called me with an update. He had obtained footage from a recent weekend Julia had claimed to be at a conference. Instead, the video showed her and Adam at a beach resort, walking hand in hand along the shore. Watching the footage, something inside me shifted. The sadness gave way to a cold, calculating resolve. Julia had made her choices, and now it was time for me to make mine. That night, after Julia went to bed, I stayed up late, finalizing my plan. I wasn't just going to confront her, I was going to dismantle the lies piece by piece, leaving no room for denial or excuses. She had underestimated me, but she was about to learn just how much I was capable of. The house was silent when Julia returned from her latest work trip. She arrived late in the evening, her suitcase rolling softly over the hardwood floors. I sat in the living room, my laptop open but untouched, a glass of whiskey sweating on the coffee table beside me. "Hey," she greeted me, her voice carrying its usual warmth. "You're still up?" I looked up from the screen, forcing a casual smile. "Couldn't sleep." She leaned down to kiss my cheek, her scent familiar but somehow offensive now. I flinched slightly, a movement so small I doubted she noticed. She stood up, stretching. "I'm exhausted. It's been a long weekend. We'll catch up tomorrow, okay?" "Actually," I said, stopping her as she started toward the stairs, "we need to talk." She paused, her hand resting on the banister. There was a flicker of something in her expression, curiosity, wariness, but she quickly masked it with a smile. "Sure. Can it wait until morning? I'm wiped out." "No," I said, my voice firm. "It can't." Her smile faltered. She let go of the banister and walked back into the living room, sinking into the armchair across from me. "What's going on?" I reached for the envelope sitting beside my laptop and slid it across the coffee table. "This." She stared at it, her eyes narrowing. "What is it?" "Open it," I said, leaning back and crossing my arms. She hesitated before picking up the envelope and pulling out its contents. Her expression shifted as she flipped through the photos and documents, first confusion, then shock, and finally, a pale, stunned silence. "Care to explain?" I asked, my voice calm but cold. Julia swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she placed the photos back on the table. Where did you get these?" "That's your first question," I said, letting out a bitter laugh. "Not, I'm sorry, or, I can explain, but where did you get these?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her mind clearly racing for a response. "It's not what it looks like." "Isn't it?" I snapped. "Because it looks like you've been having an affair with Adam Hawkins for over a decade. It looks like you've been lying to me, to our family, while pretending to be the perfect wife. So tell me, Julia, what exactly am I missing here?" Her lips trembled, and for a moment, I thought she might start crying. Instead, she straightened her posture, her expression hardening. "I never wanted to hurt you, James." "Don't," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "Don't give me that bullshit. You don't get to play the victim here." She flinched but didn't respond. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. "Why?" I demanded, my voice breaking slightly. "Why would you do this to us?" "To me?" Julia looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring nervously. "I don't know," she whispered. "It just happened. Adam and I, there was a connection. It started small, but then—" "Stop," I said sharply, cutting her off. "Don't you dare try to justify this. You didn't fall into an affair, Julia. You chose this. Over and over again, for 10 goddamn years." Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't care. Any sympathy I might have felt was buried under the weight of her betrayal. "I trusted you," I said, my voice quieter now but no less intense. "I built my life around you. Around us. And all this time, you've been lying to my face." She wiped at her tears, her voice cracking as she spoke. "James, I love you. I never stopped loving you." "Love?" I spat, shaking my head. "You don't do this to someone you love. You don't lie, cheat, and betray them for years on end. That's not love, Julia. That's cowardice." Her tears spilled over now, and she leaned forward, her hands clasped together as if in prayer. "Please, James. Please don't do this. We can fix this. I'll end it with Adam. I'll do whatever it takes." I stared at her, my jaw tightening. "Fix this? You think this is something we can fix? Do you have any idea how much damage you've done?" "I know," she said, her voice desperate. "I know I've hurt you, and I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you. Please, just give me a chance." I leaned forward, my elbows resting on my knees as I locked eyes with her. "You had your chances, Julia. 10 years worth of them. And every time, you chose him." Her face crumpled, and she buried her head in her hands, sobbing. But her tears didn't move me. If anything, they fueled my anger. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," I said flatly. "The divorce papers will be ready by the end of the week." Julia's head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. "Divorce? No, James, please. Don't do this. Think about the kids." "I am thinking about them," I said. "And I refuse to let them grow up in a house built on lies." She tried to argue, to plead, but I was done listening. Standing, I gathered the photos and documents from the table and slid them back into the envelope. "You can stay here for now," I said, my voice cold and detached. "But I want you out by the end of the month." Her sobs followed me as I left the room, but I didn't look back. Upstairs, I locked myself in the guest room, knowing I wouldn't be able to share a bed with her ever again. Lying in the unfamiliar bed, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. The confrontation had been cathartic, but it hadn't brought closure. The betrayal still lingered, a sharp ache in my chest that refused to fade. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain, the life I thought I had was gone, and there was no going back. The days after the confrontation felt surreal. Julia stayed in the house, as I had allowed, but we barely spoke. Her presence was a constant reminder of the betrayal, and each encounter felt like reopening a wound. The kids seemed oblivious, and I let them be. They didn't need to know yet, not until I was ready to explain what was happening. I focused on the practicalities. Meetings with my lawyer. Sorting through financials. Planning for the inevitable division of assets. It was mechanical, detached. I wasn't ready to face the emotional fallout. Then, a week after the confrontation, I received a call from Eric, the private investigator. "James," he began, his tone cautious, "there's something you need to know." "What is it?" I asked, already on edge. "I was going through some additional information related to Julia's finances," he said. "There's a discrepancy I think you should see for yourself." "Just tell me, Eric." "There's another account. A trust fund. It was set up about 10 years ago, and the beneficiary isn't you, or your kids." My heart sank. "Who is it for?" "I'd prefer to show you in person," he said. The next morning, I met Eric at his office. He handed me a folder, inside of which was a bank statement for an account I hadn't known existed. The numbers were staggering, well over $500,000. My jaw tightened as I scanned the documents, looking for clues. And then I saw the name, Nathan Hawkins. "Who is Nathan?" I asked, my voice low and tense. Eric leaned forward, his expression serious. "Adam Hawkins has a son. He's 22 now, from a previous marriage." "What does this have to do with Julia?" Eric slid another document across the desk. It was a birth certificate. My breath caught as I read the name listed under the mother, Julia Collins. The father? Adam Hawkins. My vision blurred, and the words on the paper seemed to swim in front of me. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying your wife has a son with Adam. She's been funneling money into his trust fund for years." I couldn't breathe. A decade of lies suddenly made sense. The frequent conferences, the unexplained expenses, the years of betrayal, it all pointed to this. Julia hadn't just been unfaithful, she had a secret life, one that included a child I never knew existed. "Does he know?" I managed to ask. Eric shook his head. "Unlikely. The trust fund doesn't specify a relationship, just that Julia is the contributor. I don't think Adam's son knows she's his mother." I sat back in my chair, the weight of the revelation pressing down on me. All this time, Julia had been living a double life, balancing her role as my wife with her secret obligations to a son she had with another man. "What do I do?" I whispered, the enormity of it all crashing down. That night, I confronted Julia again. She was sitting in the living room, her face pale and drawn. She looked up when I entered, her eyes wary. "We need to talk," I said, my voice colder than I intended. "About what?" she asked cautiously. I dropped the folder on the coffee table. "Nathan." Her face went ashen, and she froze, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for words. "You thought I wouldn't find out," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "All these years, you've been lying to me, not just about the affair, but about him." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't care. I was done with her tears. "I never meant for you to find out," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." "How did you think it would happen, Julia? Were you planning to keep this secret forever? To take it to your grave?" She buried her face in her hands, sobbing. I didn't know what else to do. I was young and scared. Adam didn't want him, and I couldn't. I couldn't give him up. "So you hid him from me," I said bitterly. You built this entire web of lies and dragged me into it. I didn't mean to hurt you, she pleaded. I thought I was doing the right thing. For him. For us. For us. I laughed bitterly. There hasn't been an us in years, Julia. Not since the day you decided Adam Hawkins was more important than your family. Her sobs grew louder, but I felt no sympathy. Instead, I stood, towering over her as she sat hunched on the couch. I want you out of this house by the end of the week, I said. And don't think for a second that I'll let you near our kids until I've figured out how to explain this mess to them. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. James, please. Don't take them away from me. They're all I have left. You should have thought of that before you betrayed us, I said coldly. You made your choice, Julia. Now you have to live with it. In the weeks that followed, I began piecing my life back together. Julia moved out, and the kids stayed with me, their lives blissfully untouched by the chaos behind the scenes. I hadn't yet decided how, or if, I would tell them the full truth. As for Julia, she reached out a few times, begging for forgiveness, asking for another chance. But there was nothing left to save. The woman I thought I knew was gone, replaced by someone I couldn't trust. Then, one day, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from Nathan Hawkins. Dear Mr. Collins, it began, I recently discovered something that has changed my life. I'm writing to you because I think we both deserve the truth. The letter went on to explain that Nathan had found out about Julia through an accidental conversation with Adam. He had learned that the woman who had been secretly funding his education and life wasn't just a distant benefactor, she was his mother. I don't blame you for any of this, he wrote. But I thought you deserved to know that I've decided to meet her. I hope someday, we can all find peace. I folded the letter and stared out the window, the sun setting over the horizon. For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of calm. The truth had finally come to light, and though the scars would remain, I was ready to move forward. It wasn't the ending I had expected, but it was a beginning. And for now, that was enough.